Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we are going to share real Skinwalker Encounters horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. The Skinwalker is coming. Nothing can stop him. I've been hiding out for a long time. I've lost count of just how long. Days, weeks, maybe even months. While I have time, I'll tell you my story before it finds me. My name is Ryan Everdeen. I'm an average guy with no unusual traits or features, except the fact that I have an extreme fascination with all things supernatural, which is what led me to being here now. If you think I'm lying, don't waste your time here. Get out before you've seen my story, before you become its target. Have you ever heard the rule, never go in the woods alone, especially at night? If not, it's likely you knew it from common sense. Hell, I wish I had known better. There's a place in my hometown called the Midnight Circle, a place that is said to be the home of an extremely powerful skinwalker. It's a grove located deep in the mountains, and you'd have to be extremely lost to find yourself there. I, being the supernatural nut that I am, had the great idea to go there late at night, alone. Stupid idea. I get it. I had it well planned out, charms and blessings to protect myself, and I almost managed to beat the creature at its game. After many hours of walking, I couldn't find the circle and gave up. I collapsed against a tree trunk and fell asleep, somewhere in the woods. I have no idea how long I slept, but when I woke, I was not where I had fallen asleep. I found myself in a grove of trees, and I could hear something at the far end of the grove, but I couldn't see it. A sudden fear took hold of me, and I knew it had discovered me. I heard a rushing noise, and there it was, a terrifying, immensely tall creature. It appeared to be a cross of a minotaur and a dryad, and had holes where its eyes should have been. The creature stared at me and let out a ghastly sound, a screech that I felt in my bones. I see. You don't understand demonic. Nevertheless, I will tell you the same. You have intruded on my domain, and I will now tear your flesh from your bones and make a meal of you. The Skinwalker said this in a slimy, foul voice. "WW, who are you?" I said, letting the fear take hold of me. "I am Eostrulv, the Lord of Skinwalkers, the King of Wendigos, and the Reaper of Flesh." The Skinwalker was ready to pounce, to tear me apart, but it couldn't, because I had my protections. I began to move my head ever so slightly to look for an escape, but the Skinwalker had predicted this. "Foolish human, I may not be able to kill you, but you're trapped here. The seventh dimension is my home, and you can never leave. I will not play your games, demon. I will leave this wretched place and never return." I spat back at it. I was growing angry. This is what he wanted me to do. As I looked around, I noticed an area where the darkness didn't seem as dark, and I decided to head there when I distracted it. I shall look for an escape, since you cannot touch me here. The Skinwalker did not reply, which made me feel uneasy. My unease grew when the Skinwalker drew back and gestured towards the lighter darkness. "Be my guest," it hissed, sliding farther away, with a grin upon his face. I stood up and looked directly at the Skinwalker, maintaining eye contact while heading towards what I presumed was the exit. I stepped through the odd light patch and jolted awake. I had fallen asleep, and it had all been a dream, I assured myself. I stood up and began to bolt out of the woods when I heard the bone-shivering cry again. It had not been a dream. I had let the Skinwalker into the world, and it would be after me. In my panic, I forgot that a Skinwalker can follow you anywhere, in any realm, even through your dreams. I could hear trees crashing to the ground as a new creature formed to chase after me. A giant, four-legged beast grew above the trees, and it began to search for me. I kept bolting and came to a road, hoping someone would pass by. To my luck, a truck passed by, and I jumped in front of it. I hopped in the passenger seat and told him I'd give him $100 if he got me to an airport as fast as possible. I am currently traveling abroad under a false name, which I will not reveal here in case any of you are found by him. If you have advice, share it, because I have very little ideas as of what to do now. Second story. I don't think my dog is really a dog. I'm currently hiding in my closet, shaking in fear. I'm typing this out on my phone, so I'm sorry if there's a formatting issue or grammar, but I don't really give a right now. In case I don't make an update to this post, please report this to the authorities, or anyone please, I don't know what to do. During April of 2018, I adopted a 5-month-old puppy from the pound. I was lucky enough to get her out of that hellhole and into my loving home. She was a border collie mix, and her name was Nellie. I don't know what happened to her, but what I have now is not my dog. She was a timid little pup when I first took her home. I remember she was inside for at least 5 minutes before she peed on the carpet. I could only laugh and kiss her because I was so happy. She slept in my bed that night, and for many more nights to come. She only weighed maybe 6 or 7 kilograms when I first picked her up. The months that followed were amazing. For the first time since I graduated high school, I was over the moon. Every day when I got home from work, she would rush to greet me with her lead dangling from her mouth, her tail wagging wildly. She absolutely loved to grab the newspaper from the mailbox with me. She was also an awesome chick magnet, but that's besides the point. She loved my neighbor, a nice man named Paul, whose wife had recently passed away from breast cancer. He was an older gentleman, well into his 50s, but never looked a day over 40. He liked to throw a barbecue for the few neighbors we had in our little rural community. He always made an effort, so we all returned the favor with bringing food and beer. Things began to change in December of 2018. In the early hours of the morning on the 5th, I believe, Nellie woke me up. I grabbed my glasses from the bedside table and flicked on the lamp. She was stood about a meter from the door, pointing right at it. I could hear a low growl emanating from her. Curious, I got out of bed and opened the door. To her surprise, there was nothing there. I thought that would have been the end of it. A few more days passed, and on the 9th it happened again, early hours of the morning and pointing at the door. This continued for the next week. I believe this is when Nellie disappeared. At about 2 a.m. on the 21st, Nellie woke me up and wanted to go outside. She would do this once every few weeks, so it was nothing out of the ordinary. She would wake me up by licking my face and then sulk and lay down in front of the door if I wouldn't get up. Behind my backyard is a forest that extends for miles. Sometimes Nellie liked to hunt down rabbits and possums when we would go for a walk through the woods. When I let her out that night, she walked to about 5 meters before the tree line. I watched her pee, and she started her way back to the house. This is when things didn't go exactly as planned. She must have heard something because she whipped around and pointed at the trees and growled. I thought it might have been a rabbit, but thinking back on it now, it was probably something much worse. She barked, then made a beeline for the trees. She disappeared into the thickness before I heard more barking. Then nothing. Absolute silence. I was about to grab a torch and put on my red bands, but then the trees started rustling. There was no wind. It was distressing to say the least. Then they stopped. I called out her name and waited. About a minute later, she wandered out of the trees and back inside. I thought nothing of it and promptly went back to sleep. I should have thought about it. As the months continued, things got weird. She stopped wanting to go on walks. She cut back on her food and began to get skinnier. I decided to change up her diet from dog biscuits to meat. She liked that. She really liked that. Sometimes she would run off into the woods to go hunting for rabbits or anything she could get her paws on. I also noticed she began to get bigger. Not fat bigger, because as she got bigger, it looked like she got skinnier. Then she stopped playing with her toys. That weirded me out the most because her beloved squeaky duck toy I got for her the day she came home was always with her inside the house. Now it lay gathering dust in the corner of my room. But she began to show a liking to the barbecue get-together Paul would throw. A little too much. Honestly, that should have been a warning sign. That day was the 26th of February, 2019. In the following weeks, people unfortunately died. It was small to begin with. That makes it sound better than it was. Old people died first. As sad as it sounded, we all thought it was because of old age. Then we got the details. Horrific details. They were murders, violent and bloody murders. We were absolutely shit scared then. Paul and I started communicating a lot more than we used to. A text every hour or so just to check in, or maybe a phone call or two. He told me I should keep the key for my gun safe in the lock in case of an emergency. I listened. I listened because I trusted him. I listened because he was one of my only friends. This brings us to tonight, the 24th of March. I awoke to the sound of gunfire. I rushed over to my curtains and yanked them open. Paul's house was on fire. I immediately rushed to put on some thick clothes and grabbed a flashlight and my phone ready to dial 111 for a fire truck. At the time, I didn't even notice my bedroom door was open when I clearly remember closing before I went to bed that night. Nor did I notice Nellie was missing. I yanked open my back door and I froze. It was illuminated by the bright fire of Paul's home. It stood on its hind legs, tall and lanky. Completely black with white highlights over its body. The eyes were almost a glowing red. Its claws were massive, and sadly one set was clearly protruding through Paul's chest. I actually don't know. It felt like so long ago, even though it was only an hour ago. I couldn't feel a thing. I couldn't even feel the flashlight slip through my fingers and land heavily on the concrete ground of my back patio. I instantly realized my mistake, and I saw it look at me. It looked me deep in the eye, and I saw her. Her. My sweet girl. My Nellie. Or more rather, what was pretending to be Nellie. It dropped Paul to the ground and terrifyingly reared its head into the air and howled deeply. It sounded like a mix between the sound of absolute pain and what I could only describe as Lupin's howl from Prisoner of Azkaban. That was the only motivation I needed to run. I hauled ass into my bedroom and dived into my closet and shut the door. I covered myself in dirty washing and stayed still. It felt like I laid there for a few million years. It walked, or skulked more rather, into my room. I heard its claws clatter across the hardwood floor before stopping. I couldn't see a fucking thing. But I heard it howl once again before it sounded like it tore my bed to fucking bits. I heard glass smash and hard objects collide with the walls. Then nothing. Complete silence once again before I heard I skulk off and leave the house. Probably to finish eating my friend. It's now 7 a.m. I can hear sirens outside, but I'm too afraid to leave lest that thing is waiting for me on the other side of the door. The inky thing I could do for the last few hours was type this out and do research. But it didn't make sense. I Googled everything I remembered about that thing. I got a result that I'm fairly certain is what it is. It didn't make fucking sense. I read pages upon pages of this fucking thing. Looked at artwork, folklore, everything. It doesn't make sense. The research says the location of the creature is found in the United States, usually on Native American land. So what in the living fuck is a goddamn Wendigo doing in rural New Zealand? Third story. My house in flames. Skinwalker story. I glanced out of the window trying to make out the woodland outside through the rain pouring down the panes. This has become habitual for me now. Around every 15 minutes, I subconsciously check the tree-line. It has been 2 years now since my first encounter, and my life has changed dramatically. I keep a loaded gun with me at all times, although I am not sure how much it will help me. I cannot enter a deep state of sleep anymore. A part of my brain stays awake at all time listening for danger. The creature has been following me since we first met deep in the woods, a memory that still haunts my dreams. Sometimes waking up in terror sweating, I could swear I can smell its putrid odor. I have been told that the creature is a skinwalker, a creature of Native American lore often thought of as a witch. They are known to disguise themselves as an animal in order to get close to the people that they wish to harm. In my case, the abomination manifested itself as a deer, although its disguise was poor. A rotten deer carcass walking on its hind legs, its neck broken and hanging to one side. In the 2 years since then I have had 4 encounters with this creature, but this story is about this night. Each encounter has been when I am alone. The sight and smell of the creature has filled me with terror like I have never felt before. I live alone in a cottage near a woodland. The trees border my property, and there is a small wire fence separating me from the woods. I glanced at the clock, 2:34 a.m. It is around this time I feel the most alone and vulnerable. About this time it usually shows up. I opened the window to see if I could see through the rain. The sound of the downpour filled my living room. Outside it seemed quiet, the noise of the rain hitting the trees the only sound. It was then I saw the shadow. It stood still in the tree line, the only object not swaying in the wind. My stomach dropped, my heart beating faster. The familiar terror was creeping back into me. I slowly and quietly closed the window and locked it. I then circled my house, checking that all of the doors and windows were locked up tight. I loaded my pistol and took off the safety. I have read that guns cannot hurt a skinwalker, and I have never been able to get a shot off at it before, but it made me feel somewhat safer anyway. I turned off the lights and looked back through the window. The shadow was gone. I looked around frantically for any signs of movement within the trees. It was then that a loud, slow, rhythmic banging on the back door started. The knocks were heavy, rattling the door on its hinges. I let out a small yelp, unable to keep it in. I ducked down below the windows and crawled on all fours to the back door. The banging seemed louder, each knock jarring my mind a little further. I took aim at the door and pulled back the hammer. A pain spread through my chest, and I realized that I had been holding my breath. I took in a large breath and choked on the putrid smell of rotten deer flesh. An all too familiar smell now. I gagged, and as I did so the banging stopped. The cottage seemed deathly quiet. The rain had stopped abruptly, further emphasizing the silence. There was a loud noise outside the kitchen window. I turned to look and carefully stood up and peeked out of the window. A couple of smashed roof tiles lay on the ground. It was on the roof. The fear was too much. I expected it to get easier each time, but in actuality, each encounter the terror got worse and worse. I started sobbing quietly. I thought about this thing following me for the rest of my life. The thought was unbearable. I heard a window pane break upstairs. It was inside. I heard its heavy footsteps through the ceiling. It was searching through the rooms upstairs. It wouldn't be long now before it found me curled up on the kitchen floor, sobbing to myself. I looked at the loaded gun. The stairs creaked. It was heading downstairs. The handle of the door leading from the stairs turned. I raised my pistol. The door flew open, and there it stood, its smell enveloping me. It was wearing the same deer. For 2 years the same animal in the same state of decay, walking on its hind legs, its front legs hanging at its side, its head hanging to its left side. The sockets where its eyes were glowed red. The first time I believed it to be a reflection from my campfire, but every time its eyes had the same dull red glow. I meant to fire 5 of my 6 shots at the creature, saving the last for myself, but in fright I squeezed the trigger once too many. 4 of the shots hit their target. The others were wide, hitting the wall and the door. The sound of the shots were deafening in the small room. The smell of cordite faint behind the smell of the creature. It didn't even flinch. The bullets hit their mark. I could see the flesh wounds, heard the dull sound of the bullets impacting flesh. It looked at me for a moment and let out its familiar scream, high-pitched and undulating at the same time. My blood felt like ice. I made a desperate sprint for the garage door. I flung it open and stepped into the dark garage, slamming the door behind me. I leaned with my back against the door as the creature struck it. The force was so great I fell to the floor. I leapt back up and tuned the key in the lock. It began hammering the door with such force I was sure that the door would break from its hinges. I looked around, my eyes darting from object to object. I saw a gas can and a blowtorch. I decided to burn it, try to end this once and for all. I pressed the button on my remote to open the garage door, flung open the car door, and inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The car sprang to life. I reached for the gas can and fumbled with the screw top, my arms shaking and my fingers not obeying my commands. I poured a pool of gasoline by the door. I picked up the blowtorch and clicked the button. The blue flame seemed so bright in the darkness. I tossed it into the pool of petrol and it ignited just as the door was forced from its hinges. I leapt into the car and without even shutting the door put it in drive and slammed my foot to the floor. In my mirror, I saw the creature stood in the doorway. The remaining fur on its rotten body was alight. It seemed not to be concerned about the flames leaping up its body. I hoped with all my heart that it would burn to death in my house. As I drove down the drive, I kept glancing in the mirror, watching as my house and all of my belongings went up in flames. I lost sight of the creature, but my whole being was praying that it was dead, and I wouldn't have to live like this anymore. Later that morning, I stood on the steps of my house, the flames extinguished. I explained what had happened to the fire service, but they looked at me with disbelief. As a courtesy, they checked for animal prints around the house, but found no signs that the creature had been there at all. The insurance company would not pay out as it was concluded that I started the fire. I am now staying in a hotel far into the city and away from woodlands. I still do not know if it perished in that fire, although no body was found. I still cannot rest. I still check the windows. I am not sure how much longer I can live like this, how long I can carry on living in fear. No one will believe my story, and I have been forced to attend counseling due to me burning down my own house. I will try to write up my other encounters soon, but it takes a lot out of me to put this on paper. Although each time it is read I do feel slightly better. Even if it is not believed, at least I don't just have to keep it to myself. 4th story. Skinwalkers are worse than you think. I had always been afraid of something, for as long as I can remember. Whether it was the dark or some unknown monster, it never seemed natural to me. I always had the feeling that I was being watched whenever I was alone, watched by something beyond my control. It was a constant feeling that could only be ignored, like tinnitus or the sight of your own nose. After many years of feeding this fear and becoming increasingly obsessed with horror, I stopped believing in my intuition despite its constant presence. And it was on one such night of reading some generic, scary story that decided to go upstairs and ask my father about dinner. The door to the bedroom of him and my mother was open and the lights were off. He was napping and, strangely, laying on my mother's side of the bed. I knew he was asleep, but it was getting later than it should have been for dinner, so I stirred him. He grumbled and rolled over to face me. "I just need to rest for a little longer, Rar." His speech drowned out and became deeper as he trailed off and his eyes melted out into black ooze. I screamed and ran downstairs as my eyes began to water. I was going to tell my brother what had happened, but he was nowhere to be found. I ran into my father's office space and started to lock the doors to the two entrances, but his voice said to me, "What are you doing?" I saw a monster in your bed, and it was you, and it died and its eyes melted. He looked at me and said, "I wasn't upstairs at all. I believe you, but what the hell?" I locked the doors and explained that I thought it was a skinwalker. He told me he had heard of them, and after a long discussion he decided that we should stay in the office. Then, one of them walked in. It was taking the form of my father, but it had an expressionless face, and once it saw my terror, it started walking towards me with a soulless glint in its eyes. I grabbed a letter opener and stabbed it in the heart through its ribcage. It silently struggled as I kept stabbing it in the neck and chest, until it eventually died and dissolved into nothingness. Another one came in the form of my brother, with the same look on its face. Despite its lack of expression, it said, "What's going on?" That was all I needed to charge at it and stab it to death. It again vanished and left no trace. But despite knowing it wasn't my brother, I started to feel a little bad. I wondered if I was starting to become as heartless as those creatures I loathed so much. The next one took the form of someone I had perhaps seen in the past, but had no chance of being in our home. I grabbed it by the lower jaw and slammed its head into my father's desk, but it started struggling. Its jaw tore off practically on its own, and it started trying to bite me with only its upper teeth. My father stomped on its head until the creature began to dissipate like all the others, taking with it its jaw and blood. I started to feel like a horrible murder, just as bad as those creatures. But there was another one. It grabbed me by the neck from behind and started biting my skull. I can barely remember what happened next. My father ripped it off me and threw it on the ground, but it looked like my mother. He hesitated for a moment, too long for it to stay laying on the floor. It started gnawing at his ankle, and as he crushed it into oblivion, it began to scream. It was an ear-piercing scream that sounded like nothing I had ever heard. Its whole body started deforming and its face became something I couldn't even comprehend, until the sound of its scream stopped instantly and it was gone like it was never there. I was worse than all of them. I was a disgusting monster. My mind was rapidly deteriorating. I walked towards the next one peacefully with a dead soul and told my father that he was just delaying inevitable. We would all become one. There was no use drowning out your fears or fighting against it. You cannot run from me. You are not safe from me. Fifth story. A story about a skinwalker. I promised this story against my better judgment. When I was a lad, my grandma told me about skinwalkers. Could be things they weren't. Walk the earth in a day. Couldn't even tell 'em by their tails. As in Oriental tales, they never kept them. But they didn't ever let a grudge go. And that's how this story sort of begins and ends. Now I need to preface this story by saying this. There's this old saying that when you're trying to outrun a bear, you really only need to outrun one fella. So, with a knee that doesn't like to stay in its joint, an angry hip, a busted wrist, and a few busted ribs, that guy is me. I'm the guy you are outrunning in order for the bear to eat. That being the case, I have some compensation factors. And that leads to this story. I had this friend from work. His name was Mike. Mike had a house up in Paradise Valley, which is a place north of Winnemucca. And Mike was very happy in house for some time. One day, Mike comes to me and says, "Rum, I need a favor." Well, of course, what do you need? Something is getting on my roof at night. I can't seem to catch it, so I wonder if you'd shoot it for me? He did ask nice. So rounded up my old BB gun, figuring I'd shoot a squirrel around 3 a.m., and then possibly drink a beer. So, there I was, at the middle of dark night, perched on a hill, watching the roof of Mike's house. kinda nodding off because I'm a slacker, and I hear a noise, and it's coming from his roof. So I peer over the sights, and there's a man on Mike's roof. He's peeking around, poking and prodding like he's looking for something, and he's dressed up like a old-timey Injun, like a breechcloth and a bad hat. There is the solution to this problem. I just put a BB in this guy's butt, and we never hear from him again. So I took careful aim, and if you ever fire a BB gun, pfft, he yelped, which is all that saved me. He looked square at me and jumped, and in one jump he covered 100 yards and was right square in my face. A half-naked guy with a coyote skin on his head. And I'll never forget this part. Handsomest dude ever. Like, I'd go gay for this guy. Chiseled muscles, flashing teeth. Awesome. And he picked me up like a rag doll and started slamming me around. I busted the plastic butt of my cheap BB gun across his face, which seemed to make him angry. He slammed me into the dirt, and things were not looking good for Rum. Then I heard a shotgun report, and he jumped. And he ran away. Shortly, Mike came to drag me to my feet. We retired to Mike's house and determined a few things. 1. We was dealing with a skinwalker. 2. It wanted in Mike's house. 3. It couldn't get in Mike's house. And 4. It wasn't immune to bullets. Having tried to make a wreck of me, I was all in favor of killing it. Not being outvoted in this matter, we decided to rumble with this feller on his own turf, in broad daylight. In the early light of dawn, we were both full of coffee and strapped up like Pancho Villa, ready to take down a whole army, and went on the trail. Now, east of Paradise Valley, is the Oahe Desert. Not only is it the biggest place left in the U.S. with no paved roads, but it's the trickiest desert to navigate. Looks flat to the eye until you dive into a swale. And it's right that way those tracks led. There's 100 miles of that desert if there's a single one. And this fella could jump 100 yards at one bound. But we was determined we was gonna get the jump on him. You can guess how that worked out. As we was following this draw, every once in a while, one or the other of us would see a coyote. Just up the ridge, just a little out of rifle range. And as the day went on, we still kept seeing him. The day went longer, the trail went cold, and there we were, two fools wandering in the desert, being stalked. What to do? Are we hunters or hunted? What we did was what you never do. We split up. You take the high road, and I'll take the low road, and if you hear a shot, come in shooting. As fate would I have it, I took the low road. So I cut around this canyon, kinda obliquely, if that's a word, and I heard a shot. As I previously mentioned, running very fast is not one of my many skills. I pumped it up to as fast as I go, in the direction of the shot I heard. There was another shot, and I topped over a rise, and there was this guy, and there was Mike under him. Unironically, his walnut stock was serving him better than my previous plastic one. I took aim and clipped him in the shoulder. With a glance, he knew where I was and was right on top of me. I couldn't even rack in a new round. He was that fast. 1 second, I'm firing a rifle. Next second, he's trying to rip out my bones. I'm gritted up, thinking this is it, trying to grab this guy's nuts, when I hear a rifle report, and this guy flops over me. There was Mike down there, firing freehand with a rifle with no stock. As quick as he was down, he was back up, Mr. Coyote hat, and off like a rocket. Mike trudged up to me, and there was blood on the ground. Some of it wasn't even mine. We decided to regroup. After that, well, Mike never had no more trouble, and I got mostly better. So, that's the story. 6th story. The Skinwalker's House. I want to share this story because someone might find it useful But I share this information urging you to be extremely careful, and I beg you to never use it unless you find that you must. During my freshman year of college, I lost control, mostly due to freedom from my parents and a group of friends who were more interested in a good party than a good grade. I spent more time sleeping and drinking than I did in class or studying. But all of that changed when I woke up in the hospital bruised and covered in cuts. I was told I had been in a car accident the night before. I and two others were driving home from a party when the car crossed into the center divider, rolling several times and tossing all of us from the car. Miraculously, I escaped the crash with some scrapes and bruises, but mostly unharmed. The other guy in the car, Michael, broke his arm and got a bad concussion. However, the third occupant, a girl named Sam, was tossed in front of the rolling car and crushed underneath it. It took a rescue crew 4 hours to extricate her from underneath the crumpled mess of metal, and by the time they got to her, she was beyond saving. The police had no idea who was driving during the crash, and I couldn't remember anything about that night due to my state of impairment. Michael and I got stiff warnings about driving while intoxicated or getting into a car with a drunk person, but other than that we got off scot-free. My friends all said that Sam had been driving and that I was so up I couldn't even walk, let alone drive a car. Despite their reassurances, I was haunted by guilt and uncertainty. Had I been driving when we wrecked? Why did I survive? Was I responsible for her death? Every night I had nightmares of Sam calling for me from underneath her twisted metallic grave. I stopped leaving my dorm, stopped answering my phone, consumed by guilt and uncertainty. After a month of moping around my dorm, a friend of mine named Mark reached out. We talked for hours about my uncertainty and how I would never get answers. In response, he told me about the legend of the Skinwalker's house, a ramshackle green shack right off of Highway 380. Here a person could meet with the ancient beings and make deals and bargain, including asking questions that otherwise could not be answered. At first, I was incredulous. I thought Mark was with me, trying to play a sick prank, but I was desperate to know. So I talked to some friends who had grown up on a nearby reservation. One of them put me in touch with a tribal elder named Richard, and after a few emails and lying about doing a research project, Richard told me about summoning a skinwalker, which the Navajo call Yinaldushii. When we first spoke, Richard was hesitant to talk about the subject, but after repeated calls and a face-to-face meeting, Richard explained the ritual to summon a skinwalker. As we finished our conversation, Richard warned me that when one makes a bargain with a witch, the witch always takes something in return. I will give you the same warning that Richard gave me. Yinaldushii is not to be summoned or questioned on a whim. Please do not summon a skinwalker unless you are ready to accept the consequences of your actions. If you decide to disregard my warning, you will need the pelt of a coyote for animal fat candles, a rosary that has been blessed by a priest, a liter of animal blood, and a crow's feather. Skinwalkers are most active right after sundown when there is a storm coming in from the southeast. The house where you can meet them is between mile marker 13 and 14. It's not hard to find. It took 3 months to find everything and for the perfect weather system to arrive. Mark and I drove together to the house around 5, just as the sun began to sink underneath the Magdalenas. Shadows oozed from the dilapidated house, its putrid green paint peeling off of the bleached bones of wood. The house had no windows or doors remaining, and I could smell the mildew and rot from the road. Mark and I climbed through the barbed wire fence in front of the house and made our way in as storm clouds rolled in, bringing with them peals of angry thunder. As we stepped inside, the smell of old rotting wood overwhelmed me, and I fought the urge to vomit as we sat down on the stripped wooden floor. We spread out the coyote pelt with the head facing me, placing the greasy wax candles at the ends of its paws. We then placed the crow's feather in the mouth of the coyote pelt. After setting up the pelt and lighting the candles, Mark left the house and parked the car at a turn off a mile up the road. When I was sure he was gone, I took the rosary in my hands and pulled hard, scattering the beads across the floor and pelt. I sat down at the head and took the goat's blood I had procured from a butcher and dumped it across the pelt, spattering myself and the ground in dark maroon splatters. The storm continued its steady progression across the desert, and the roar of thunder rumbled in my chest. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of the storm willing the creature towards me. I was lost deep in my focus when I heard it. A wolf's howl mixed with the screams of a woman, a horrible cacophony of animal and man swirling together. I opened my eyes to see the house wreathed in fog, the supernatural mist surrounding the house but not permeating the structure itself. I heard a deep, guttural chant coming from behind me as the creature approached the dilapidated wooden structure. Then came the footsteps. Heavy padding steps crunched against the gravel behind me, quickly followed by the creak of wood as it stepped into the house. Its hot breath stung at the back of my neck as it sniffed me before circling in front of me. It had taken the form of a huge gray wolf, far bigger than even myself. The legs were too long and spindly, the hide patchy and balding, and its ears were short and tattered. The skinwalker sat across the pelt from me and stared at me, staring at me like I was a rabbit about to be devoured. Its eyes were unlike those of a wolf's, with dark brown iris, angry white sclera, and round pupils. Suddenly the wolf let out a pained yelp and began to shudder. The braying whimpers of the animal filled the house as the fur and skin began to slough off the creature. The flesh sizzled and popped like frying meat as the body began to disintegrate, quickly followed by the opening of the chest cavity as a woman crawled out of the quickly decomposing wolf carcass. She had Native American features with skin so wrinkled and scarred I couldn't even guess her age. Hair hung in black stringy strands, and worst of all, her lips were stretched and mangled so that her mouth could never close fully. She wore a patchwork of skins and pelts and a pair of antlers atop her head. Even sitting, she was nearly a head taller than me. She locked eyes with me, inhuman horizontal slits like a goat's peering out from behind the mess of hair that hung around her face. Her voice croaked in her throat, and a harsh guttural dialect spewed forth from her lips. My heart sank. How could I have been so stupid? Why would an ancient Navajo which speak English? She must have noticed my disappointment because she reached for a pouch on her belt and took out some sort of gray waxy substance. She spread it on the tips of her index fingers, leaned forward and jammed her fingers into my ears, her long dirty fingernails scratching my ear canal. I yelled in pain and surprise at the intrusion, and she shifted her weight back into a sitting position. For a split second my hearing faded before the sound of the storm surged back to life with a loud crack. The old woman locked eyes with me again, her face lit by the flickering candlelight. She spoke again, this time in English. I have given you the gift of hearing. What is it you seek from I who goes on all fours? Her voice low and raspy, like sandpaper on stone. My voice caught in my throat, my gut tightening at her words as I began to drift into a daze. I pushed my fingernails into the flesh of my palm until I could focus again. When I did answer, my voice was weak and uncertain. I need to know if I killed her. She cackled, her voice spiraling to a crescendo until she sounded like a coyote baying at a frightened rabbit. Very well, Billigana. I can help you. But what have you brought for me? My stomach twisted painfully again as fear clawed at the back of my mind. I haven't brought anything to give you. Very well. If you have nothing to give, then I must take. Do you agree to these terms? I paused for a moment, considering what Richard had told me, But my guilt overwhelmed my rationale, and I shakily nodded my head in agreement at her terms. The skinwalker smiled at this, revealing rows of miscellaneous teeth in her cavernous, distorted mouth. The teeth were inhuman, with sharp wolf-like canines mixed in with broad, flat teeth like a horse, in a horrible conglomeration of stained rows of ivory shards. The laughter came again from her lips, horrible coyote cackling that made my skin crawl. After another round of laughter, she produced a crude stone knife from her belt, and with a quick motion ran it across the palm of her hand, spilling dark rivulets of blood onto the pelt before reaching towards me. I extended my hand, and she dug the cruel stone into the soft flesh of my palm. My skin cried out in agony and blood wept from the exposed flesh underneath. She clasped my bleeding hand with inhuman strength and pressed my wound against her own. Our blood mixed, and I felt it trickle down my arm and pool at the crook of my elbow. The woman began to chant and stared into my eyes as blood continued to flow freely down our arms onto the pelt beneath us. Her voice grew rough and animalistic as she continued her chanting. As suddenly as she had started, she stopped and let go of my now throbbing hand. "Oh, Billigana, how foolish you have been, just like your forefathers, with their drink and their endless cruelty. But her blood is on her own hands. Her foolish pride gave way to steel and glass. I have given you your answer, and now I will take two things from you. I take from you not Idzeal, your dreams." A wave of relief washed over me. I could live without dreams anymore. My dreams had been plagued with visions of Sam calling out for help from beneath her metallic tomb, begging for my help, with inhuman strength and speed. The skinwalker grabbed my hand again and brought it to its mouth. I pulled hard against its grip and yelled to no avail, as it pushed my thumb into its mouth. Hard teeth clamped down hard against the appendage, tearing away the flesh and bone of my thumb. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting a sanguine picture on its face. The creature chewed, and I could hear the crack of bone and the squelch of soft flesh in its teeth. I screamed in agony, clutching my hand and pressing the wound to my chest. My vision faded and blurred as I slumped to the floor. I wish I had gone unconscious. I wish I had closed my eyes. Instead, I watched as the skinwalker tore at the flesh of its face, its long claw-like fingernails shredding through skin and muscle. The skinwalker grabbed the skin on its arm and pulled, tearing it away from the muscle underneath, the flesh coming away like wet newspaper. I watched the muscles of its arm bulge and flex as it tore away the soft skin of its stomach, disemboweling itself. A gray coil of intestines lolled out of the abomination's abdomen, dragging against the rough wooden floor. It continued tearing away its flesh until only scraps remained on a skeletal frame. I willed my eyes to close, but they would not. I stared transfixed on the horrifying visage in front of me. The figure dropped to all fours and pulled one of the pelts it was wearing over its face. The pelt stretched and contorted, spreading over the skeletal limbs. The figure trembled and shook, twitching unnaturally. Then it began to grow, the limbs stretching and contorting, the chest becoming narrower. I watched as two sets of large antlers splintered out of the top of its head, stopping just before the ceiling. The figure continued to shift and contort until finally, a massive bull elk stood in front of me. It strode out of the house, then paused and looked down at me. We locked eyes for just a moment before it let out a loud bugle and took off into the night. I pulled off my shirt and wrapped it tightly around my still bleeding hand. I staggered out of the house and glanced around, afraid the creature was waiting for me outside. There was nothing except for the rumble of thunder and the throbbing in my hand. I walked the mile to where Mark had parked the car, all the time pleading with my body to not bleed out. Mark paled when he saw me and rushed me to the hospital. I told the staff at the hospital that I had been messing with old farm equipment, a story they bought easily enough. In spite of everything that happened, I felt relieved with the knowledge that I hadn't killed Sam. The Skinwalker kept its word. It did take my dreams. Because now I dream not about Sam, but instead about the Skinwalker. I dream of the Skinwalker changing and shifting. I watch time and time again as it tears apart animals for its dinner. The worst is when it attacks people, as I am forced to watch as it stalks hikers and campers. I watch as it disembowels them, mounts their bodies onto tree limbs, or skins them alive. I don't go into the woods anymore, for fear that I may see that thing again. But now and then as I drift off to sleep, I hear the sound of an elk bugle, followed by peals of coyote cackling. 7th story. Skinwalker. I won't reveal who I am, or much about where I live. And to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened. But I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning. This is a very long read, and some of the content below is very disturbing, but I can't hold back. Here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in a church. You don't let the American flag touch the ground. You don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway. And since no one else was going, he managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So, I ended up going with him, reluctantly. The whole way there he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with, so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends admit being asses to friends. Sometimes, I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it, a lot of locals, and even some you didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to urinate. I stepped off of the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past a shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget, though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns and brush, but suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, There was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer I saw things had been carved on them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around, as if they actually had been a perfect brick wall and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame, number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day, and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head, moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that it was making far too much noise, and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off, or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time, it was funny. Hey, Buck. Yeah, you, horny motherfucker. Leave us alone. He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. Mark. I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. Mark? I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far, I knew, because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things, too. In addition to the blood, pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. Mark? I called out, furiously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward, along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine, with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it'd hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. Mark, I murmured, then called out again, Mark. Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please, give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself this wasn't real. At first, I saw a head, the head of a buck, but it came forward, and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared-looking, even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of the average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked, with very human genitalia. Its penis was dripping blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and its legs. They started human, but near the bottom they started distorting and became animalistic. At the ends of its legs were powerful hooves. At the ends of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment, there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then, the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang, suddenly. It's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all my life, but it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow, I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up at the trail, at the point where it went up between 2 mountains and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there, near the beginning of the trail, was the skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in dreams, nightmares. That creature, the skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's raped and mutilated corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long, that had been quietly penetrated. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.